Hey, we're live. Hi, I'm Brian. Welcome to the IGDA Des Moines chapter monthly meeting. We have Josh on here. We have EB behind the camera, and we've got a lot to cover today. This is going to be great. Just to go over a couple slides with y'all. So just open it up real quick, get some words in, and then we'll get you straight over to Josh because he's got some good stuff to cover today. So we are the IGDA Des Moines chapter, IGDA chapter Des Moines, however we say that. Our goal here is to get connected with the right people, help support you in your goal to be a game developer, a game artist in the game development area. I love these intros, right? It always works out. So regardless of your skill level, regardless of where you are, if you're a super professional working for a AAA game studio, or if you're just an indie, if you're just a hobbyist, we want to hear from you. We would love to connect with you, love to see where you're at, and just again, hear from you. So feel free and reach out to any of us. Feel free and reach out to Josh. Feel free and reach out to anybody using our Slack channel. Over on the side of this slide, we have our Facebook page. We have our Facebook group. We have a Twitter handle, which is not super active, but as I've been saying this last year, we're working on that. We have our Slack channel as well as a Discord channel that are active. And if you want to participate a little more in interaction with other individuals, we do have a Minecraft server as well. We do have other events that go on throughout the month, such as Making a Game, which is something that's being run by Jeff Schaeferman right now. More details on the Slack channel, or Discord, so go check it out. One other last thing, become an IGDA member today if you're interested. So one thing that it provides you is additional knowledge. So access an extended expert resource library. There's a community of individuals to be able to provide you just, again, more resources, more people just to talk to in case you have any questions. Advocacy, make sure your voice is heard by governments, game studios, companies. Amazing group. They're always doing something for the community, always doing something for people. Icing on the cake discounts. If you're an Unreal, or excuse me, not an Unreal, Unity individual, you can get a discount on a membership subscription. Yeah, my words are mixed up right now, but I'm trying to get to Josh. So feel free, and if you do join as an IGDA member, use the Des Moines chapter as your home. We will be able to get a little additional bump ourselves to be able to put back towards the community. So without further ado, we do have Josh here today. So Josh is going to be talking to you about, the title of his talk is How to Turn a Mechanic into a Game, and taking something that you want to do and make it a little more reality. Josh is co-founder of, I don't want to get I keep getting him and another one mixed up. He is co-founder of Numinous Games. Josh has been doing a lot of great things in our community, as well as with the IGDA Des Moines chapter. So Josh, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. So yeah, as Brian said, my name's Josh, and I work here in Des Moines and part of Numinous Games. My partner Ryan lives in Colorado, so we're a remote studio, and we are working on 3 games currently. And I want to talk about an interesting thing that I learned within the last year, really, about a new methodology for game design, ultimately. And so yeah, I thought I could share it with everyone because I'm just excited about learning this new thing and how it helps me. So yeah, my talk is entitled How to Turn a Mechanic into a Game. Really, I mean video game first and foremost. So some of this stuff you could apply to board game design or tabletop role playing or LARPing or whatever. But really, its focus is on video games. So keep that in mind. I am part of Numinous Games, but really I've been an indie game developer for about, let's see, 16 years. And I've got the gray hair to show it now. Although, yeah, there you go. There, see, check that out. And so I developed games kind of across a wide range of different fields, from like a first-person shooter that wanted to be a AAA game but didn't quite have the budget. I guess you'd call it maybe like a III game these days. I've developed a MOBA, multiplayer online battle arena game, which was actually a Flash game, crazy Flash MOBA. Some mobile games, most notably, I worked on That Dragon Cancer with Ryan Green, so that was Numinous Games' first title. We've worked on some VR games before, a Daydream launch title, Untethered, and so on. So I have a good amount of experience. I guess you would call me a senior game developer in industry terms. But even though I've been in the industry for quite a while, I came upon this problem, which like over and over again, I would have a game jam game or a prototype or some kind of experiment, and I would flesh out a mechanic. I would have some, you know, small piece of it that represented a couple minutes of gameplay or something like that. And then it was sort of this question of now what, you know, like, how do I take this little thing that I think has promise, that I think is interesting? How do I take that and flesh it out into a full game? So it's not necessarily that I was afraid to continue moving forward. It's just I didn't really have an organized way to take this little thing and turn it into a game. So there was this kind of regular solution for a lot of the games I worked on, which is, I guess you could say, kind of like trial and error, referencing the Dead Cells trailer here. Death is just the beginning. You try something, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, you know, trial and error. You just keep trying things over and over again. And that does work, especially if you have the tenacity to do it. But it definitely felt kind of like wandering in a desert or something, where it's a little disorganized or just really, really organic, I guess you could say. You know, you would come up with ideas for more mechanics, then you would try those out. Maybe it would work, maybe it didn't. You know, over time, you kind of developed a vision for the game. So then you try and make things in a way that it fits the vision. So you would develop more mechanics, and then you would think, do those mechanics match the vision or not? And that's all good, but it wasn't necessarily, with my process anyway, in my history as a game developer, it wasn't necessarily an organized system. And over time, even, like, you kind of fall in love with this process in a sense. Like, you think of yourself as this romantic Red Dead Redemption, you know, cowboy traversing across the Wild West or whatever, like, for a continuous amount of time, you're always riding off into the sunset or something. I don't know. But yeah, that was like how I thought about taking a small thing and turning it into a big thing for many years. But last year, I kind of was introduced to this new methodology from Mike Stout. So I was very fortunate in that I took a level design mentorship from Mark Webster, and he was, I was kind of became his apprentice for a while, and he was an apprentice of Mike Stout. And so he introduced me to this game design methodology, which Mike calls Trinity. And it really opened my eyes, I guess you could say. You know, it was like a vista, you know, like I was able to see this vision of things, and I could see like, oh, this thing connects to this other thing. And it was like a system. And so, so yeah, I was just really excited to be introduced to this thing that's like much more organized than what I had done previously. And so, so yeah, I do want to start with a caveat though, that this is biased. So what I mean by that is, if you think of like the Trinity method as a system for designing a series of challenges, there's a couple important words that I want to highlight as part of that. So the first is series. So if you think of a series of challenges, for me, the first thing that comes to my mind is like levels, you know? So you start with one level, you go to the next level, or maybe there's some element of like being able to choose which level you're going to. But otherwise, like series means, you know, multiple things that are grouped into small chunks. And so you're going through those chunks over and over again, and each chunk represents a specific challenge. So this methodology is very much tailored toward games that are like that have challenges that can be grouped into chunks. And then you experience this chunk, then you experience this next chunk, then you experience this next chunk. So historically, you know, that means you're going to have levels in a game. That doesn't always necessarily happen now. You know, we've got like open world games. So in Breath of the Wild, when you're going on your kind of like genocidal rampage, fighting the bad guys in Breath of the Wild, you come upon these camps. And so even though it's an open world and it's not like a series of levels per se, you have these camps that are their own chunks, and you can go from camp to camp to camp. Now, obviously in an open world game, there's kind of layers of things. So camps are sort of one layer, dungeons are another layer, and so on. But things are, even in this open world game that feels very organic and free flowing, things are broken up into chunks that you could think of as a series of challenges. So this methodology could even apply to open world games. The next word I want to highlight is a system. So this isn't the system, it's just a system. And the screenshot that I showed of the Trinity is Mike's blog. And so a lot of what I'm showing is just straight out of the blog, but kind of filtered through how I understand it, with some small tweaks and stuff, and hopefully making it a little more visual than if you were to read through the blog yourself. But yeah, he makes this point as well, that this is just how he thinks about it. And for me, this is how I was taught as part of my mentorship. So it's not the end all be all. This is just one system. I think it works really well for certain games, at least to get you going, you know. So starting off, principle 1, a game is fundamentally a conversation between designers and players. So this isn't necessarily his definition of what a game is, like if you were to define game, but it's more of just a principle that you should think about when it comes to this system, that the designer is creating something, and when the player plays it, they're having a conversation with the designer. So just think of it as like a lens that you can look at a game through this lens, and this system very much relies on this as kind of part of its foundation. When I say conversation with the system, like really it kind of comes down to like a Q&A. So the Q part, the question, is sort of like the designer asking, how will you do blank? And for the player, their answer is going to be, I'm going to use the designer tool blank. So as you play the game with this framework, the designer is constantly asking like, hey, what are you going to do about this thing? And then you're going to answer like, oh, I'm going to use this tool in the game in order to answer this question, essentially. So that's kind of what I mean by a Q&A. There's a question and there's an answer. And in this framework, it's really important that you think about it in terms of, you're going to design both. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about how you're asking the question to the player, and then you also want to think about how is the player going to answer that. So that's definitely something that's an important part of this framework, as we'll see as I dig more into it, you know. Okay, and so backing up just one second. So for the player answering, I'm going to use designer tool blank. That represents a choice that the player is making. And it's not just two choices, like I'm going to choose between left versus right. The idea is that it should be a field of choices, meaning that there's obviously more than two and some kind of like continuity to it instead of just a fork, if that makes sense. So here's an example situation. You are the player, you're the gray blob, and you come upon two enemies, right? This is like very typical game situation, a combat focused game with scenarios where you're confronted with enemies. The enemies want to kill you, you want to fight back, right? So the question then would be, in this situation, what's the best way to attack? So the question is, what's the best way to attack? And the player is then answering that question. So how will you do blank? Use designer tool blank. That could translate to, what's the best way to attack? Maybe use area of effect weapon blank. Okay, so let's see how that plays out. So this is one option. You have kind of like a rifle or a gun that kind of shoots in a straight line. So it's very like narrow area of effect. There's another gun, maybe it's a shotgun, that can have a cone area of effect. So with this, you'd need to shoot multiple times in order to hit both enemies, right? This one, maybe you'd only need to shoot once because of the cone of effect. And then another possibility could be a grenade. So you lob a grenade, it explodes, and at the point that it explodes, there's an area of effect that could injure or kill both enemies. Okay, so now what happens if you put a twist on that? Let's say you put cover in front of both enemies. And now things are like a little bit different. You have to think about this a little differently than you did before. And so maybe you could think of the question as, given the terrain or given the environment, what's the best way to attack? In that case, you might come to the conclusion like, oh, I'm going to use the grenade. The grenade's the best way to attack in this situation because I can throw it over the cover. It would be too hard to shoot with my rifle or shotgun or whatever because the enemies are behind cover. And Stout calls this a meta question. And so you have your kind of like base question, and then there's a meta question that kind of like adds additional context on top of the original question. So the idea with that is you keep stacking those layers until the player always has enough choices. So in terms of like thinking of how do you add mechanics to the game, how do you continue to design your game so that it has a good amount of depth and nuance and complexity that makes the game interesting. The idea is you have these questions and then you're kind of stacking additional parts on top, meta questions, as he calls it. All right, so just to kind of recap here, principle one, thinking of a game is fundamentally a Q&A between designers and players. And one example here, how will you do blank? Use designer tool blank. And then, like I said before, that last part where the player answers, I will use this tool. That is their choice. So I mentioned earlier choice fields. So now I would kind of want to dig into what is a choice field? What does that mean? So a choice field he defines as a collection of spectrums, and together they describe a game mechanic. Now he defines game mechanic really specifically. If you're familiar with the MDA framework, mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, it's really more like that. If you're not a big deal. Just think of it as the concrete stuff of a game. So it's definitely broader than just like things related to you interact with the game. It encompasses just a lot of like concrete aspects of the game that aren't necessarily related to like what happens when you push the button. You know, it's broader than that. So that's what a choice field is. Here's an example choice field. You have an enemy. The enemy has high health and slow speed. So they're kind of tough, I guess you could say, and slow. That would be one example choice field. And like I mentioned, it's a collection of spectrums. So in this case, there are two in this example. And so if we kind of focus on just one of those, that would be the health. So health, you have high and low. And so really what I'm doing here is, and what you do as a designer, is you kind of choose extremes. You know, you have like the minimum extreme and the maximum extreme. And so the spectrum is like from the minimum to the maximum, whatever that means. You know, obviously tuning and playtesting and stuff would help determine, and also, you know, your vision or what you're trying to communicate with the game would determine where you set those. But generally speaking, you know, it's a limited range, right? And in terms of what an individual spectrum is a dimension of concepts, and they're the same in nature, but they differ in degree. So let me break that down a little bit. For health, you have the high health and low health. So that means like the high extreme for health and the low extreme for health. So the nature part, when I said that they're the same in nature, that's the health part. And the degree is whether it's high or low. So I know that might, for some of you, that might sound like super, super simple, but it's going to get more complicated, I guarantee you. So try to internalize the simple parts before we move on, because it'll get more complicated for sure. So yeah, just to recap, a dimension of concepts, they're the same in nature, but they differ in degree. Now, the reason why it's important to internalize that is because there's this other thing that is really easy to fall into when you're designing in general, but also using this framework, which is if you were to invert those, that's a binary choice. So binary choice being like all or nothing, completely one thing or completely the other thing. And so if you think about like the dimension of concepts, in this case, now they differ in nature, but they're the same in degree. So that sounds a little confusing with words. So a diagram, at least for me, helps a lot better. So if we look at health, you've got max health and min health. That's the spectrum, right? There's a spectrum of health from minimum to maximum. A binary choice version of that would be if you're alive or dead. So being alive and being dead are two different natures, but they're the same degree, which is that you either are or aren't that thing. So when it comes to like trying to use a few elements and get interesting gameplay out of that, Stout recommends that you try to use a spectrum when you can, and try to avoid binary choices. And here are some examples. So like left versus right, yes versus no, or kind of in the worst case, like right versus wrong, in the sense of like what is wise to do as a player. You know, obviously, almost always players are going to choose what they think is the right choice. But with spectra, it could be short versus long, narrow versus spread out, slow versus fast. So hopefully it's starting to sink in like what the difference is there, and how that it could apply to different game design situations. So thinking back to a choice field, a collection of spectrums, and they describe a game mechanic. Another way that I think about it is like a collection of dimensions, and they describe a game mechanic. So if you think about a choice field, and back to the health example, that's one dimension. So you could think of this like pure, very, very simple example as a one-dimensional choice field. So here, let's say you have two enemy types, and the only difference is this one-dimensional choice field of health. How many hit points does it take to kill them, right? Enemy A, 2 hit points. Enemy B, 10 hit points. So you have a weak enemy and a tough enemy. And you have a weapon, just one weapon, that's it. It deals 3 hit points of damage per shot, okay? So if you think about the choice field, I chose a low extreme example and a high extreme example. So enemy, sorry, I messed them up on my slide, but enemy A is supposed to be the low one, and enemy B is supposed to be the high one. So here, slightly more visual example, if we go back to what I was saying earlier about coming upon 2 enemies. One of them is 2 hit points, one of them is 10 hit points. Your weapon does 3 hit points of damage. Which will you attack first? Well, that's kind of an obvious, I mean, at least in this like super simple example, nobody's moving, there's no other variables in the system, right? Obviously, you would want to attack enemy A first. So in this super simple example, it's kind of like choosing between right versus wrong because it's such a simple example. So if you think about like, I'm choosing between 2 enemies, the choice is kind of automatic, therefore it's not a very meaningful choice. What you can do is now think about making the choice field more complex. So now you could add another dimension. So here's a 2-dimensional choice field where there's high and low health and then high and low damage. And by damage, I mean how much damage is dealt. So how strong is the attack of the enemy. So now, instead of having a low and high extreme for health, you can have low and high for health with low damage and with high damage. So you can go from like 2 extreme enemy types to 4 extreme enemy types. Now this is a field, which means really you could put them anywhere. The specific points, you know, that represent the enemies could be anywhere within this field. The tricky part is once you start moving them so that they're close to each other, it gets harder to distinguish between them as a player. So it gets kind of blurry, you know? So here's a good example of what I mean, using the previous example. Let's say you still have your weapon, deals 3 points of hit damage. Then you have your 2 enemy types, and instead of 2 and 10, it's 4 and 6. So with this slide here, you know, like when you look at it in this form, 4 and 6 seems like reasonably distinct. But because your weapon deals 3 hit points of damage, really in order to kill both enemies, you need 2 hits. So in effect, they're the same enemy type in this limited example. And so they're not actually distinct. So a good practice using this framework is to try to make the different types of whatever more distinct. So you want to push them toward the extremes, at least at first, and then fine tune after that. And so, so yeah, with the 2-dimensional choice field, you have high health, low damage, high health, high damage, low health, high damage, and low health, low damage. So you could think of that as kind of like a defender. So the defender can't really attack very strongly, but they have a lot of health. You're heavy, the tank, whatever, what have you, high health and high damage. The attacker deals high damage, but maybe isn't very strong or is easy to kill. And then the swarmer, which is sort of like bats, or that's kind of how I think of it, as like they're bats or something. So they're low health, don't really deal much damage. So at this point, like, if you think of the series of challenges, it's kind of becoming more of a system. And that's what I really like about this, is it organizes it in a systematic way, which I think for games that are a series of challenges, it's a really good fit. You know, a kind of gamey game is sort of how I think of it, a video game that is more formally a game. So with the yes, sorry, did somebody have a question?
Yeah, I apologize. I wanted to get this question real quick. If
yeah,
it's all
no,
right.
no, that's fine. Yeah, feel free to interrupt me. Sorry, I should have mentioned that at the beginning.
Yeah.
Questions are totally fine. Go for it.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, so this one is actually from GB Games. Welcome, Franco. So the question that he has for us is, can you help me explain how to reconcile the idea of spectrums as a range, but taking the extremes versus the idea of not wanting binary choices? It goes on to say, we want to avoid binary choices, but a big part of this method is taking the extremes. So which sounds like taking the entire range and only using the binary extremes and ignoring the rest of the values.
Yes, that is an excellent question. And I have struggled with that same thing. Usually the spectrums are, they're continuous, but in practice, they're variable, if that makes sense. So let's just think about the enemy example, right? You have high health and low health. You're shooting them with your weapon, right? You get 2 shots in, well, now they're medium health. So it is a spectrum in the sense that it can vary throughout gameplay, but you kind of set up your situation from the start with the extremes, and then as you play the game, then you will experience the gradation in practice. So that's kind of, at least at this point, like how I'm thinking of it. There's just more ambiguity like in the moment than when you're kind of designing it in the abstract designy world outside the context of actually playing the game. So hopefully, as I like dig into more specific examples, you can see it'll become more clear how in reality it ends up more ambiguous, and that because of that, you want to push toward the extreme to counteract the ambiguity that naturally occurs when you go to implement it. So hopefully that answers it well enough that you can at least like sit back and at least wait for a little bit more concrete examples. But yeah, great, really good question. I asked myself that even while I was putting this together again. So yeah, very good example, very good question. So yeah, 2-dimensional choice field. Again, like you're designing both though. So in this example, this was the enemy, right? So you could think of the enemy as the question. And if the enemy is the question, then what's the answer? Well, one of those answers would be the weapon that you use to fight the enemy, right? So, so in this case, you have ammunition. How much ammo can you use with the weapon? And then how much damage does the weapon deal? So those are two other dimensions in kind of the weapon choice field. And of course, if you use the same principles, you have like more distinct weapons that are a little bit more extreme. High and low ammunition, high and low damage. So some examples, high ammo, low damage, meaning you can use the bat over and over and over again. But it's low damage, so maybe it's like made of plastic or something Nerf, I don't know. A sword, high ammo, high damage. So if the sword is durable, you could swing it over and over again. Essentially infinite ammo in a sense, and deals high damage because it's sharp. Chainsaw, low ammo, maybe it overheats or just otherwise like you don't have that much gas, but deals high damage. A twig, low ammo, low damage because the twig could break, so it's not very durable. So those are just some examples. But if you think about the enemy types, there's this kind of parallel concept to them where you have this choice field that gives you certain enemy types, and then you have a choice field that gives you certain weapon types. And there's an aspect to it where it feels like it kind of goes hand in hand. I'll get into more details in just a little bit, but just I just want to bring that up because it will become a part of the framework, and so it's just worth mentioning now. All right, so we have a two-dimensional choice field. Of course, we can add an arbitrary number of dimensions, but for human beings, it's definitely easiest to think of a three-dimensional field as the next one. So if you have health and how much damage you can deal, maybe another one would be range. And so if you think of like the previous example, defender, heavy attacker, swarmer, those ones could be close range. So now you have like longer range versions of all of those. So we went from 4 enemy types, and by adding another dimension, now there are 8. So yeah, in the case of like the cube, you know, each point on the cube represents a type of whatever that thing is, in this case, enemies. With weapons, same thing. So in the case of like weapons that have more range but are otherwise the same as before, guns obviously have range relative to like hand weapons. So shotgun, Gatling gun, sniper rifle, pistol. These are Mike Stout's examples here. So if all of these are long range, you know, that's how they could break down in terms of ammo versus dealing damage. In terms of enemy types, here would be an example of you're combining all of those enemy types together. And so if you think about it like on paper, let me just go back to here. So you've got the 4 enemy types. That really doesn't seem like that many different enemies. It seems kind of simple, but when you get to the example of like what it actually looks like in game, this is 4 different enemy types. And if you played a first-person shooter, this setup is like, whoa, like this is, you know, at least for kind of like typical first-person shooters, you don't usually have like that many more enemies that you're dealing with at once than this amount right here. So there's 4 different types. There's a lot of enemies in general. It's a lot to deal with. So in practice, having like 8 different enemy types and 8 different weapons is plenty, especially for like a couple hours of gameplay or something like that. That's plenty of variety, because in practice, you just don't usually deal with like that many things simultaneously at once. And so, so yeah, like 12 enemy types sounds good, but usually that's like spread out over multiple hours, you know, or potentially even an entire game. So I just wanted to bring that up because for me, at least, like looking at it on paper, it's like 4, it's not that many, but you can do plenty with 4. So, and you don't need them all, you know. If there's 8 possibilities, maybe you're only using 6 of those because 2 of those, like, they just don't really fit your game or whatever. So just to recap about choice fields, a collection of dimensions, and they all work together to describe a game mechanic. So previously, you know, I showed you the enemies and the weapons and how they kind of go together. That is part of the framework. And what I'm calling it, this is where I kind of break from Mike Stout's terminology, because I feel like a good way to explain what he's trying to say next is mechanic pairs. So if you think about like 2 of them that go hand in hand, one of them is the question, the other one is the answer, then I like to think of it as like a mechanic pair, because they work together. And it's not necessarily an exclusive pair either, as we'll find out. But yeah, thinking of the principle as like the game is a question and answer session between designers and players. You need to design both of them. So you have the question and the answer, they go together. Kind of brings us to the second principle, which is creating a challenge to ask the player a question. When you do that, you want to create a tool to answer it as well. So another example, other than just kind of enemy attributes versus weapons, is enemy placement versus weapons as well. And so you could think of it like which weapon the player chooses to use is affected by where the enemies are placed in the game world. And so those things are pretty interrelated. And so that kind of makes them a pair. One example of a pair. So I like to think of the mechanic pair as the 2 mechanics are relating to each other. One of them is the question, one of them is the tool or the answer. And the mechanics have choice fields associated with them. So for enemy placement, you kind of have like, one way to think about it is the horizontal plane and the vertical plane in terms of your sort of field of view. So in the case of like some of the examples of third-person combat or first-person combat, but it's 3D, that's one way to think about it. For low verticality and near horizontal, so like the horizontal plane, you kind of have like things that are closer to you, things that are farther away, things that are lower, things that are higher. Flat terrain, it's low verticality, and your closeness to the horizontal is near. If there's a gap, a horizontal gap, like a cliff or a gully or whatever, that's low verticality, but the horizontal is more far. So another way to think about it is kind of like reach, you know, near reach versus far reach. A vertical ledge, if you're standing right in front of a cliff face, high verticality, but near horizontal. Blocking cover might be high verticality, but far horizontal, because in order to get to it, you would have to move around it in space. And then for weapons, a way to think about like what is the pair with that could be a range and kind of directness. Directness is, it's kind of a hard like way to describe the thing, but I can't think of a better one. So as I explain it though, hopefully it'll become more clear. But with the weapons, like if you think about hand-to-hand combat weapons, it's short range, but it's direct in terms of the directness. So like it's immediate. You know, you're swinging, and whatever you're swinging at needs to be right in front of you. Stout calls it weird. I think of it as like metaphysical or mystical or something. But if it was short range and indirect, imagine like something just teleports from the sky and lands right in front of you, right? So you didn't like continuously move the thing to right in front of you. It just kind of came out of nowhere because it's indirect. A straight shot would be like long range and direct. So you're shooting, you know, direct line of sight. You're shooting a bullet straight to that thing. Whereas indirect would be like a grenade, right? You're lobbing something and you have to go over it or around it. Or so direct versus indirect is in that sense where you're either going right to it or you have to go around it in some way. But those two things end up kind of being pairs because you have a distance factor and then you have the immediacy factor. So yeah, next up is if you imagine you have, you've got your mechanic pairs, right? You've got your choice fields. How do you combine those? And with that, you use what's called setups. That's what Mike Stout calls it. And so before getting into that too far, I just wanted to mention the concept of an archetype. So if you think about the choice field, a distinct example, you could think of that as an archetype. So like here, if you have health, range, and damage, the enemy types that I mentioned earlier come into play. Like the heavy could be longer range, higher damage, and higher health. Like a tank, for example, right? The tank shoots its shell, and it can shoot that from a distance. It's hard to destroy, and it deals a lot of damage. And then you could have like a near enemy, a far enemy, a swarmer. So he gives different examples here. The swarmer being like Mushroom from Mario, relatively easy to defeat. Unfortunately, I don't know Ratchet and Clank well enough to explain the far one. And then near, you know, one of the enemies that's like relatively easy from Wind Waker. I can't remember the name of that one, but for weapons, in terms of like range, directness, and damage, blaster, flamethrower, bomb, right? I feel like those are relatively easy to grasp. Terrain archetypes, flat, ledge, gap, cover, those are common examples. So then a setup is simply just a grouping of archetypes. You're taking several archetypes, several distinct points in the choice fields, and you're grouping them together. And which ones you choose determines how simple or complex the setup is. So here is a setup. You have two near enemies. And so near enemies are high health, low damage, low range. So they're close to you, typically. They don't deal a lot of damage, but it takes several hits to kill them. So this is a relatively simple setup, right? You just have two enemies. That's all there is to it. Combining them with more, you've got two near ones and two far ones. But again, because like the far ones interact with the terrain in a certain way, maybe they're on a different type of terrain. More complex setup is you have two far enemies and some swarmers. One of the far ones could be up on a ledge. One of them could be behind cover. So now you can see like you're starting to mix multiple choice fields together in order to create a certain setup. And then the example that I showed previously, where you have all these different enemy types, you have different terrain types, they're all mixed together. You have to figure out like, what am I going to do? Which weapon am I going to use? Am I going to throw a grenade first at the heavies, or am I going to use my flamethrower first on the near enemies, or what have you? So that's sort of the concept of setups, thinking of these as like, you're going to take these archetypes, these points in the choice fields, and you'll combine them together in different ways. Obviously, like this setup is more difficult than, you know, pretty much any other setup, especially this one. So this is a relatively easy setup, and then you're getting more and more difficult over time until you get to this more complex example. So if you think about, okay, now I've combined things and I have setups, I have multiple different types of setups. When you string them together, that's what he calls ramps. So obviously the ramp concept relating to like how some setups are simpler and often easier as a player. You know, if you imagine that difficulty or the intensity increasing over time, then as you go along those setups, it acts as a ramp. And so this screenshot is from Jesse Schell's book, A Book of Lenses, where he talks about how do you design an interesting, what he calls an interest curve. But Mike Stout kind of thinks of it as like intensity. So the intensity of the experience varies over time. You don't want it to be a perfectly flat ramp, right? Because then it's super predictable. But there are times where it's more intense and less intense. And overall, you know, in a broad sense, it's getting more intense over time, with some larger rests in between, and then some smaller rests in between the parts that are between the larger rests. So it's kind of recursive, I guess you could say, if you're a nerd like me. But intensity can be thought of as like the relative difference in complexity or how much skill is required between the different parts of the game. So in terms of like setting up a ramp, if you think about a Mario-esque example, you have like a simpler mushroom-ish enemy, one that throws hammers. Maybe you just have a gap that you jump over. That would be kind of another setup. And then here, you could combine them together. So first you have the easier enemy, the harder enemy, then you combine both of them together. You have to deal with both of them at the same time. Then there's a gap. Then you have a gap, but then at the other end of the gap is the simpler enemy. Then you have a gap, and at the other end of the gap is the harder enemy. And then you have a gap, and then both of them are at the other end. So as you can see, like you can start thinking of these different choice fields, different mechanics pairs, and create setups. And then based on the setups, you know, you would organize them in a specific way, so that it gets more complex over time. But then there's also an aspect of variety. So so like dealing with two enemies that are distinct feels different than each one individually. So that kind of becomes its own setup. But then you kind of want to like reintroduce dealing with certain enemies, but you could put them in a different context. So like in this example, AC is, okay, I did the gap. Now I need to do the gap while dealing with this other enemy. And so with the intensity ramp, the idea is you're finding these setups, you're trying to understand like, do they have specific, do they evoke specific emotions? Do they have certain difficulties? And you're constructing an intensity ramp based on difficulty or based on emotion, or you know, whatever your vision for your game is. And you're doing that over time. And there are these different rest points as well, where you know, you don't always just want to like have the same intensity and you want to add some variety, you want to give some down points. That way, when you reintroduce the intensity, it feels intense again because you've rested. So in this example, Stout set up kind of this Mario level. And this is an example of, just previously, there was this, this more abstract example, A, B, A, B. What does that actually mean in practice? This is what it can mean in practice. So yeah, you have A and B are together, and then the rest. And you can see here, he's also varying the terrain slightly as you're going through the level. So obviously, there are multiple ways that you can add variety to the setups. So the enemies here, you really just have two types of enemies, but it feels like a reasonable amount of variety for this level. If you just look at it visually, and if you played Mario before, you're like, oh yeah, this seems reasonable. But on paper, sometimes it can feel really simple. But when you look at this on the screen, you're like, oh yeah, that looks like a normal level. Here's another example, a gap with the simpler enemy A type. Then you have a gap with the enemy B type, and then you have a rest. And in this case, like with Mario, I feel like this is a intuitive Mario thing, like rest. When you rest, you're rewarded, like they kind of go hand in hand in a lot of Mario games. And so then, yeah, you have like the ABC where there's a gap with both enemy types. And so there are distinct situations that can happen when you combine specific ones together, like, oh, with the gap, you actually have to time your jump more carefully because you also have to worry about the other enemy. So even though like this is relatively simple, there's still interesting things that can happen when you combine them together. So yeah, that's like an example of a couple ramps. Then of course, like the question is, okay, I've got multiple ramps. What do I do when I connect them together? That's what he calls paths. So here, you've got like a ramp in between 2 points. You've got 3 ramps in between 4 points. A path just being basically a sequence of ramps. And then of course, at this point, I feel like you kind of have like the traditional level design thinking setup of, okay, now we can like fork paths in certain ways. We can have them loop back on each other. We can just have an offshoot and then you come back to it. So here, like, you can kind of think of level design as really coming into play with how you design your paths and how you lay them out. Here's one example. It's just a linear level. Obviously, the terrain varies so that it looks like there's interesting variety to the spatial layout, but otherwise it's linear. And you can imagine, like, at the different points along this path, there are different setups, and you're trying to create an intensity ramp where over the course of this path, it's following your intensity ramp for your level. Here's a slightly more complex example of you kind of have like loops where there's a loop of just path A, you take path A and it comes back to itself, to the hub. And then path B and C together kind of comprise a loop. And then there's a point where path B turns into path C where you can take a shortcut back. So here, like, again, if you think of each path has different setups, and each setup has a combination of some kind of different archetypes, those points on the choice fields, that kind of comes together into what's essentially an entire level. So from here, like, for me, this was kind of the part where like it connected the dots that I needed connected. And from here, I could extrapolate and be like, oh yeah, okay, this makes sense. You know, I can create setups. I can combine those setups into ramps. I can combine the ramps into paths. I can combine the paths into levels. I combine the levels, and now I have a game. So, so yeah, that's pretty much the gist of at least like what I took from the framework. The reason why it's called Trinity is there's actually 3 sort of ways that you can look at the game, and this is just one of those ways. Things that are like more aesthetic, I guess you could say, it kind of comprise the other aspects. There's this idea of the questions, which is what I was talking about, the context and the theatrics. But for me, like, it was really the questions part that was the most useful, and that's what I got the most out of. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on here. So yeah, that's pretty much the framework in a nutshell. And thank you, and I will take questions if anybody has any questions now.
Yeah, no, Josh, thank you. Walking through this, taking a look at that, the Trinity method, it's definitely a lot more complicated than really just looking at it from face value from a title. So yes, thank you for walking us through that. We do have a few questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one. Wow, of course, I brought a monitor up towards me now. I've got one hiding halfway. So let's find this. So this one is from Chariot Writer, excuse me. So I'll just go ahead and read this off. It says, so far this framework has been very good for describing certain kinds of games. But is this design framework for iterating on more abstract kind of games? So for instance, how can this be used to develop puzzle mechanics where the difficulty really is not as easily quantifiable?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I feel like puzzle games are usually a lot less linear. They're really highly nonlinear. So like thinking of a puzzle game in terms of paths is probably not as helpful. But I do think that if you get as far as the setups, then that can become really helpful even for puzzle design. So there are definitely ways to think about puzzles in terms of breaking it down into setups. So like I've studied Stephen's sausage roll a little bit. I haven't actually played it yet, but there are plenty of indie designers, game designers that I respect, and they think of it as like one of the best puzzle games ever designed. And if you were to like watch that game for a while, you'll notice that you can start breaking down the puzzles into setups. So for example, excuse me, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the game, but you have these sausages and you have like a fork and you stick it into the sausage, or you can choose to roll the sausage, and actually with your fork, you turn. And so in order to roll the sausage, you have to turn. So there are these like weird situations where you don't want to turn, but you want to roll the sausage. So then you have to like figure out a way to move around the map to get to a specific direction in which to hit the sausage so that when you turn, you roll it, but you're not stuck, you know? So like with that game, if you imagine you're just on flat terrain and there's a grill. Yeah, sorry, I forgot that part. So the reason why you roll sausages is you're rolling them onto a grill to cook them, and then you can cook each side. And so the idea is like you want to cook each side, and you don't want to do it too long because you don't want to burn them, right? It's like a super interesting puzzle game, I think. But if you imagine one setup could be open terrain, you have a grill, and then there's a sausage right next to the grill. So you can move around freely. You just go up, go next to the sausage, you turn, you knock it onto the grill, then you move around, you knock it back, You stick it with your fork, you know, so you eventually you grill both sides. So that's one setup, right? You've got your archetypes, which is the grill that's like kind of on a surrounded by open terrain, and then you've got your sausage right next to it. But then you can think of another setup where you're up like on a ledge, and you've got a grill that's on the edge of the ledge, and then the sausage is like a couple spaces away from the grill, and the ledge itself is like a shape such that you have to maneuver yourself just right in order to get the sausage but not knock it off, because you don't want to knock it off the ledge. So that's like another setup. So I feel like with puzzle games, you can at least get as far as setups before it starts to get too hairy. But yeah, certainly with a lot of puzzle games, it's just really, really non-linear. So you can think of it as paths, but the paths would be like this spaghetti crazy web, you know, and that's probably about where this framework would break down in terms of being really useful. But I do feel like you could at least get as far as setups with puzzle games. Really good question.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Josh. We do have another one that came in again from GB Games. It says, and this actually brought up a little conversation in chat, so you'll have to hop in chat later and read it. And some pretty interesting responses. But to get your perspective on this one, it says you mentioned that you don't need to use all the extremes. For example, you could have 8 enemies based on your dimensions, but you decide to pick 3 or 5 of them as archetypes. But would you avoid creating multiple archetypes that are of the same extreme, as in 2 different types of heavies?
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that kind of thing, like once you start to add more dimensions and you're trying to decide between, you know, like, I guess maybe one way that I would think about it is there could be certain dimensions that are more definitive than others. So like the heavy example is a great example. What constitutes a heavy is probably like, you know, 2 to 3 dimensions or something like that. And those like really strongly define what a heavy is. But then there would be other dimensions that you could add, but they're really just like a heavy with a twist. And like the strongest aspect of it is the parts that make it a heavy. Certainly like how hard it is to destroy, the amount of damage that it deals, you know, are probably 2 of the most, the strongest examples. But yeah, I would think like trying to think of it in terms of which dimensions most strongly define that archetype would help determine like which ones would be good to keep. But I think another aspect of it is also related to the vision of your game. If you have a mech game, it's probably going to have more heavies in it, you know, and that like you could create a game that's just all heavies, and like because that's the style of game that you want, you know, like that's the context that you're choosing to focus on, and then within that, then the game is actually about which way that you can add the twist to it. So I think part of it also depends on what your vision is, and like what is kind of the themes or the focus of the game that you want to make as well.
So can I get some clarification maybe on something you just said? So you were
Yes.
mentioning that if you had a game of like all heavies, say like a mech game, that's an interesting example to have, because when I think of a mech game, I also think of like maybe some stationary turrets or something. But just removing all that mech on mech, does heavy even really become a variable at that point?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, certainly like it's only a heavy if it's in relationship to something else. So yeah, I guess like maybe I overstated when I said all heavies, but if the focus of the game was primarily heavies, then yeah, in order for them to be defined as such, really you would want to have something to contrast that against. So yeah, that's a really good point. Very good point.
Awesome. And it looks like there's another comment in here that says the book that you mentioned was the art of game design, a book of lenses. Tyler Owen gave a thumbs up on that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. Good.
Awesome. Well, I do not see any other comments in here unless I missed one, EB, but we'll go ahead and end it here if that's all right. Josh, do you have any other words to say before we call it a night?
Nope. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Awesome. And just for a quick sign off, so as part of the Des Moines IGDA Des Moines chapter, I'll get it right in my head someday. Again, thanks, Josh. Thanks for everything that you do for us, for the community. And just a quick reach out to everybody who is listening. Look forward to the same time, the third Tuesday of every month, 6 p.m. We'll have another presenter next month. Look forward to that. Look out for the invite on Eventbrite, on our Slack, on our Discord. Also, if you're interested, go hop on the board channel and help us shape what the future of this chapter is. So Josh is, again, very much involved with the chapter and helps us decide our day-to-days. So as well are a lot of people that are in the chat right now. So come and join us next Monday. Hop on our board channel, check that out. But otherwise, again, one last time, thank you. And thanks everybody who's watching, and enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm happy to share my slides too if anybody wants to review. So